Good afternoon. This is Clark Neighbors with the weekly commodity wrap-up for BIS Commodities for the week ending September 25th. In a week where Yogi Berra passed away, the U.S. has had visits from the Pope and from the Chinese president. A lot going on, and then also from a grain perspective, a fairly positive week, especially here on Friday. Pretty solid market close with corn for the week up about 10 cents, beans up a little over 20 cents for this week. Now, for the month of September thus far, corn is roughly 12 cents higher than it was to start the month, and beans are up a little over 2 or 3 cents. We continue, though, to be in a very range-bound, choppy market here in the early stages of harvest. Corn continues to trade somewhere between $3.60 and $3.95 in December corn here over the last several weeks. Beans almost have a more of a narrow range, with November beans trading between $8.60 and $8.90. Now today's close above close to that $8.90 area. We're in the upper end of that range, so a close above $8.90 technically would look pretty good. Fundamentally, though, we'll have to see how things progress as we continue through harvest. Speaking of harvest, weather's been very good, very conducive thus far in many parts of the Midwest. Harvest should pick up each and every day from this point forward. There seems to be very good harvest activity in the eastern Corn Belt, namely in parts of Illinois. Starting to see some harvest increase in other areas. Here in Iowa, for example, and yields to some degree at expected levels or better than expected in most cases. We're seeing solid yields in many places of Illinois with a huge range in yields, but all in all, yields pretty solid. And I think in most cases, the people we talk to, they say the yields are a little better today than they were anticipating going into harvest. Here in Iowa, we're hearing about record yields in several locations thus far. Too early to make that a solid statement. And bean yields in most areas of the Midwest thus far are really good, and in some cases record. So, we'll see how this progresses as harvest activity continues. With the weather looking pretty open here for the next 10 days, harvest progress should make huge strides. The other newsworthy item this week, with the Chinese president, the Chinese delegation was in the States this week, and in Des Moines on Thursday they announced they'd buy 13.2 million metric ton of soybeans as kind of like a ceremonial commitment. Not a lot of details on that as far as if it's over 2 years, how much this year, if it's just normal business that we're going to see over that time frame anyway, but we'll see. But keep in mind, as far as bean sales thus far, China is well behind last year's pace. So on a week-to-week basis, when we see the export sales and also the mornings around 8 o'clock when you see the USDA announcements, I think the market's looking for some numbers here short term to justify this commitment by the Chinese. With harvest progressing, obviously a thing to watch is producer movement, and the general thought, especially talking to country elevators in the Midwest, producer movement has been very, very light thus far through harvest, and it doesn't look like that's going to change anytime soon unless we run into some logistical or space problems in isolated areas. And if the weather continues to be good, maybe we see some issues with that as harvest progressing quicker than the market absorbed that supply. But if you have a few weather delays, if you will, or rain events through the month of October, the spreading out harvest, allowing the domestic demand, especially from the ethanol plants, to chew through some of that initial corn harvest, then it's not that big of a deal. So I think that's something to watch. In the Eastern Corn Belt, as harvest progresses, some areas in the Eastern Corn Belt are well over half done with corn. Those areas are going to see basis improve quickest. So it'll be interesting to watch if we see progression from the Eastern Corn Belt to the Western Corn Belt as far as basis, and also when you look at where supply sits. The biggest supply seems to be, according to crop conditions and early harvest results, in the Northwest Corn Belt. So that supply that may need to feed other parts of the Midwest, especially when export sales out of the PNW, the Pacific Northwest, which typically Northwest corn would go that direction, that area looks pretty light right now, so that would bring availability to some of that supply to go to areas where it needs to go. So I think that's key to watch going forward. The other interesting market this week is the cattle. Huge break in cash cattle, huge break in box beef values over the last couple weeks. Last week and this week in particular, cash continues to go lower. Very heavy weights, which has been a contributing factor to this break in the cattle market. So this week, on Wednesday, cattle were limit down. Expanded limits Thursday. At about 1:30 Thursday afternoon, after the settlement of the Thursday market, the market rallied a lot. We still used the Thursday settlement at 1 o'clock, and then today, Friday, the cattle market rallied and closed limit higher. Many are scratching their heads on this huge volatility in the cattle trade this week, with over an $8 trading range. To see how that may play out via cash again next week, or if we found a seasonal slash technical bottom in this cattle market going forward, to be seen. So in summary, a few things to watch going forward. Obviously in the macro part of the market, Yellen yesterday, or middle of this week, mentioned that she wouldn't rule out the Fed actually having rates increase by year end. Number two, the other thing to watch is the Brazilian government, or the bank I should say, tried to stabilize the currency this week, which could help slow down South American selling, which was a little positive, the bean market this week. See if that has any more impact as we move forward. And obviously harvest activity, harvest progress, movement, basis, transportation, all those factors will be key going forward. And in memory of Yogi Berra, keep in mind the future ain't what it used to be. If you have any questions, feel free to call us at BIS Commodities. Phone number is 800-373-2525. Catch us at biscommodities.com. With that, have a great weekend.